What's going on, guys? Nathan here, back again with another awesome deck tech for you all today. We are taking a look at a commander build that I have spent about 8 hours on brewing, and now at this point, this is a mono blue Landfall deck. That's right, we are going to be playing Field of the Dead, we're going to be copying Field of the Dead, and we're going to be generating a giant army of zombies and swinging out to win the game. That is the primary goal of this deck. Now, because we are in mono blue and we're playing a Landfall deck in mono blue, this deck I think can compete at those 7 out of 10 power level decks. I don't know if it can hold a candle to 8 power level decks. So if you are running in a meta where people are playing Armageddon and winning with infinite combos, this deck, it will not win against those decks. However, in your casual commander meta, once again using the colloquial 7 power level, this deck is surprisingly capable of sitting at those tables, which I'm super excited to talk about with you guys today. Now, before we get into the individual card discussions, I just like to give a quick shout out to my own goldfishing gameplay videos. I will post a video where I will be goldfishing this deck in the archetype playtester. You can see how it aims to win and what turn it aims to win by. We typically do about 2 or 3 examples of gameplay with varying levels of interaction, so you can see how that plays out. And then, of course, if you enjoyed the video, leave a like on it and subscribe to see more super sweet deck techs like this one. Now, with all of that out of the way, we can talk about the commander for just a minute here. This deck is led by Baral, Chief of Compliance. Now, Baral is a 2-mana 1/3 legendary creature human wizard that says instant sorcery spells you cast cost 1 less to cast. Whenever a spell or ability you control counters a spell, you may draw a card. If you do, discard a card. And you may have clicked on this video thinking that this would be led by Cosima God of the Voyage, which is another popular mono blue Landfall commander. The problem I found was that Cosima is not only very slow, you just sort of play it and then it gets exiled for a few turns and then it eventually draws you a bunch of cards on turn 6 or 7, which is good. It's nice to have burst card draw late in the game when you're perhaps desperate. But what I noticed in play testing this deck is that it really wants a turn 2 play, and Baral is exactly what we want on turn 2, which is mana acceleration. We actually aren't running any counter spells within the deck, although I'll talk about some cards you could swap out for some counter spells if you want to go that route. But we're actually not going to be using the second part of Baral at all within this deck. So we really just want that instant sorcery mana reduction, and all I had to do was make a couple of tweaks within the deck to change some artifacts and creatures into instants and sorceries, and really just facilitate more of those tempo plays that blue is more known for. All right, and then a couple of the macro stats with the deck. We have some custom mana costs that we need to input into Moxfield, and once we do that, the average mana cost of the deck is 3.63. So a little bit higher, but that's intentional because, of course, we're just a giant ramp deck. And then our land analysis here, we have 22 blue producers, 16 colorless producers, 5 tapped, 33 untapped, and we have 10 fetch lands. And we're running a lot of other utility lands there as well. Oh, and then I did want to touch on really quick the price of the deck, because I think that does matter to a lot of folks. If we head on over to Moxfield here, which I do trust a little bit more than Tapped Out, it's at about $920. However, if I take a look at the top 4 or 5-ish expensive cards in the deck, we have Ancient Tomb, which is about $100. It's kind of amazing, actually. Manamo, School at Water's Edge, Urborg, Tomb of Yawgmoth, and Rhystic Study, and even Urza Saga. Urza Saga, maybe not as replaceable, but I think the top 4, at least, are very much replaceable within the deck. Ancient Tomb, you could honestly just put in another island and be totally fine. Manamo, School at Water's Edge, perhaps the same thing, although I just want to stipulate, maybe with Ancient Tomb, throw in like another waste basic, and then the Manamo you could replace with an island and be perfectly fine. Urborg is here to turn off our fetch lands so that we can tap them for mana and save the actual fetch lands until later in the game. And then Rhystic Study you can actually replace as well with either an instant or sorcery card draw, or there's another cute effect here with Curse of Verbosity if you want to keep it as an enchantment, and it still provide a little bit of protection along the way. 3 mana enchantment or a curse. Whenever enchanted players attack you, draw a card. Each opponent attacking that player does the same. So you're handing out some cards, but you're taking a little bit of heat off of your back and you're drawing basically 3 cards per turn cycle. Okay. So let's get into the core of the game plan here. Let's take a look at our ramp spells, which is going to be the vast majority of the deck. So a lot of the ramp spells are going to prioritize putting lands into play and not necessarily running artifact ramp. So you will notice we are not running Sapphire Medallion, of all things, because it doesn't put a land into play. So you could definitely consider Sapphire Medallion, but we're prioritizing landfall triggers. Now, as I say that, the first land we're going to cover here does not provide a landfall trigger, but it is important because it is Annex. This is 4-mana enchant land. You control enchanted land, which is important if we want to up the number of differently named lands we have in order to turn on Field of the Dead. And we'll talk about that for just a second here. So Field of the Dead is really the card we're looking to be playing the earliest and getting out the fastest. It enters tapped, it adds taps to add a colorless, and then whenever it or another land ETBs under your control, if you control 7 or more lands with different names, create a 2/2 black zombie creature token. Now, you might ask, how are we going to hit that requirement in mono blue, especially when a lot of our fetch lands are going to be searching out only islands and snow-covered islands? And to answer that, we are running wastes and also snow-covered wastes here. So we've got a couple of different basics we can search out, and then in addition, we can be using things like Annex, for example, to perhaps, Magical Christmas Land will steal our opponent's Field of the Dead, but average case scenario is that this is going to probably grab like a bounce land or something that produces more than 2 mana. There's usually somebody with Nykthos Shrine to Nyx or 3-Tree City sitting at the table that this can nab to not only deny the mana, but also add a bunch of mana to our mana pool. Hopefully, this will net you at least 2 mana, but worst case scenario, this will grab even just a basic off of your opponent's field, and if you consider the fact that the basic will tap to add a colorless, we can then increase our number of differently named lands for Field of the Dead, which might actually be a challenge sometimes within the deck. The warning with Annex is that it does really bring aggro to you from that player because people typically get salty when you steal their lands. But this has way too much upside to not put it in the deck, especially when we can possibly be getting giant synergy pieces like other Fields of the Dead, which is exactly what we want to be seeing within our game plan. And also even something as crazy as Glacial Chasm would be another sort of Magical Christmas Land scenario. Bitterthorn Nissus Animus is going to be a 3-mana ramp out a basic next turn because it says it's a living weapon, so it enters with a 1/1 germ. Whenever you equip creature attacks, you may search library for basic land card, put it on a battlefield tapped, then shuffle. And of course, we can re-equip it for 3 if we needed to, but most of the time we're just going to let that germ die, and then we probably just have to re-equip it to another creature to then ramp out another basic with that creature attacking. Crucible of Worlds in a deck with a lot of fetch lands, it basically just means that you will never miss your land drops in the late game. Just a great card overall to have on the field, and just keep getting the double landfall triggers with something like a Misty Rainforest or Flooded Strand, where it's going to hit the yard and then it goes back to the field, you play it, and then you crack it again. So just a great way to ensure double landfall triggers every turn. Dreamscape Artist is a 2-mana 1/1 human spell shaper. We can pay 3 tap to discard a card, sack a land, search library for up to 2 basic land cards, put them on a battlefield, then shuffle. This is one of the weird mono blue ramp cards, but the fact that they enter untapped is what actually makes this card somewhat playable in mono blue. Yes, we're paying 2, and then you have to pay another 3 to then discard a card, sack a land. But however, if you use the sacrifice land to pay for that ability, then you can think about it costing only 2 to activate, because we'll replace that land with an untapped land. So really what we're doing is we're paying 2, we're tapping it, discarding a card, which we might actually want in our graveyard anyway. We'll talk about graveyard synergies in a second, and then we're basically getting 2 basics out of that. So we're trading a land in our hand or something, a card in our hand, perhaps a late game card we don't need, for 2 lands immediately, which we can then use to do other rampy type of things in the early game. Explorer Scope is an interesting choice here, but I love it because it is so efficient. 1 mana artifact equipment. When equipped creature attacks, look at the top card of your library. If it's a land card, you may put it onto the battlefield tapped, and it has equip 1. And so this is important because a lot of the lands I actually built with put in with Explorer Scope in mind. So no MDFCs within the deck. We're instead really leaning on actual land types within the deck. The only caveat here would be, I think, Lorien Revealed, which is in our card draw section here, which I also treat as a land, but it's not really a land, but it is in a card draw slot. So that is, anyway, just something else of note here. But all of the lands, when we actually say we have 38 lands in our deck, we have 38 lands in our deck. And if I actually sort by type here, I believe we have 39 because I have another land in the, yeah, we have 39 there. And that's because we are running Tolarian West in the tutor slot, actually, right here. So anyway, Explorer Scope, you can slap this onto Baral, and if we don't care about Baral dying, we can just send him right into combat and have him die, and hopefully he gets a land off of that, which can be more valuable even than his own discount. So Explorer Scope, kind of interesting there. Heraldic Banner is going to be just an incidental buff for our 1/1 zombies. You'll be wanting to choose black for this particular artifact because Field of the Dead makes black 2/2 zombies. So this won't produce blue. It will produce basically black or colorless mana for the purpose of this deck. But the reason why it's in here is because it gives an incidental buff to our zombies, and really because blue is so lacking in the number of overruns accessible to it, we really want to find as many incidental buffs to our creatures as possible. And honestly, a 3-mana ramp spell is not terrible in Commander if it's providing an Anthem effect. Mimeofacture is a 4-mana sorcery. Choose target permanent and opponent controls. Search that player's library for a card with the same name and put it onto play under your control. Then that player shuffles his or her library, and you can pay the replicate cost, which will copy it for each time you paid its cost, and then it can make new targets. So the thing about Mimeofacture, this is the one that I'm most on the fence about, and you can maybe replace this with a Sapphire Medallion if you really wanted to, but I included this because it's an instant sorcery, so it gets reduced by Baral. Now think about if it is reduced by Baral, so let's say we play Baral turn 2, we untap on turn 3, play Mimeofacture. For 3 mana, it curves out really well, and it can actually basically ramp us out a land for 3 mana, which is something that I'm happy to pay, and also we can get blue off of it if we have opponents with islands or any sort of, well, I guess, yeah, and the opponent would have to have an island. So there's some stipulations here, but you always get the mana, you won't always get the island, I guess is what I'm trying to say with Mimeofacture. And then in the very late game, if you are super desperate for landfall triggers and you maybe were late to get our Field of the Dead on the battlefield, you can pay its replicate cost, which I don't believe is actually reduced because this is an additional cost, so you'd only get the discount once while casting this with Baral. But we can actually generate, multiple landfall triggers off of Mimeofacture if we wanted to. But this one I'm still experimenting with, admittedly, because without Baral, 4 mana to ramp out a land is a little bit sketch, although as I say that as we're running Scampering Surveyor and Solemn Simulacrum, but with the discount, I think it's a great curve out play as well. Mirren Safe House, 3 mana, is basically a fetch land because it says as long as Mirren Safe House is on the battlefield, it has all activated abilities of all lands in graveyards, and of course we're running a bunch of fetch lands, and so we can be basically playing this and then cracking it to search out a land immediately. Patchwork Banner, for the same reason we're running Heraldic Banner, this is another incidental buff you want to name zombies, so our 2/2 zombies become 3/3 zombies. Savor the Moment is an interesting pick here. This is a 3-mana sorcery. Take an extra turn after this one. Skip the untap step of that turn. So with Baral on the field, if this only costs you 2 mana, think of it like a mono blue Explore, because the next turn we will get an upkeep draw. So we'll draw a card and then we can play a land for that turn. So that's basically Explore. And then if we care about the combat and this is late in the game, great. We can send our zombies in and they no longer have summoning sickness, but we won't be able to cast spells. So obviously not as good as a Time Warp, but I look at this as a mono blue Explore, basically. Scampering Surveyor, 4 mana, 3/2, when an ETB, search library for basic land card or cave card, put it on a battlefield, tapped, then shuffle. We are running Urza's Cave, which is a line to go get Field of the Dead, because Urza's Cave itself, you can pay 3, sack it, 2 search library for land card, put it on the battlefield, tapped, then shuffle. So this is just a line to go get Urza's Cave, and then also can get a basic land card if we want to do that as well. Soul Ring is here. While it doesn't produce a landfall trigger, it can be searched off of our Urza Saga Chapter 3 trigger, and also it can be searched up via our, let's see, Trinket Mage, which is in our tutor category. It's always just a mana positive play. Yes, it's fast mana, so if you don't want to, play a Soul Ring, swap it out for a Sapphire Medallion or something like that. But this is always just a good card to see, and not much to say beyond that. Solemn Simulacrum, 4 mana, 2/2 and ETBs. You can ramp out a basic, and then when it dies, you may draw a card, so just a great blocker as well. Surveyor Scope is an interesting card here. 2 mana artifact, tap it and exile it to search the library for up to X basics, where X is the number of players who control at least 2 more lands than you. Put those cards onto the battlefield, then shuffle your library. So what you can do, and honestly, this card will most likely get you at least 1 basic, which is totally fine. The floor case for this card is it's a 2 mana, go get a basic, put it on a battlefield untapped, right? Which is basically Nature's Lore, one of the most popular green spells in the format. But it gets even better than that, because if there's a green player at the table, great. There often is more than one green player at the table playing land ramp. That can easily get X to be more than 1. But what you can actually do with this, and we're running a ton of fetch lands here, is if you have a fetch land on the battlefield and you activate the fetch land to then sacrifice it, then in response to that trigger, tap to exile the Surveyor Scope. What you have done is you have eliminated that fetch land off of the battlefield while the Surveyor Scope is looking at the amount of lands you have. So it will artificially lower your land count for just that one moment on the stack in order to increase the number for X with Surveyor Scope. So again, we're running 10 fetch lands. It's a good chance that we can get this to work. And then if there's another green player that's already been accelerating way beyond us, then it's going to catch us up as well. Sword of the Animist is going to allow us to get basics out every turn for basically 4 mana. For 2 mana, you can play it. For 2 mana, you equip it. Whenever equipped creature attacks, you may search the library for basic land card, put on battlefield, tap, then shuffle. Once again, it doesn't really matter what we attach this to, as long as it attacks and gets that trigger, we are happy with that. And a quick note here for notable exclusions, we are not running the Sword of Cycles, and the reason for that, so for example, if we take a look here, Sword of Hearth and Home, whenever equipped creature deals combat damage to a player, exile up to 1 target creature you own, then search the library for basic land card, put both on battlefield on your control, then shuffle. And there's also Sword of Feast and Famine, I believe, as well. I'll have on the screen here. But the reason why we're not running these is because the equipped creature needs to deal combat damage, and it costs an extra mana to play. So they're just a little too slow, a little too hard to get that combat damage trigger. And so unfortunately, these did get cut from the deck. Originally, I was running a version of this deck with Malcolm Essior partner combos as the commanders, and if you're running those commanders, highly recommend the Sword of Cycle, because Essior already has built-in Ward 3 and it's a flyer, so definitely play those. But just wanted to do a quick call out there. And then we are running an extra turn spell. So Time Warp, 5 mana, target player takes an extra turn after this one. There are no ways to loop extra turn spells within this particular deck, and there are no tutors for them either. So this is the safest extra turn spell you could possibly play, but it's in the ramp category here because basically a Time Warp is just an extra land drop, right? That also doubles your mana because we get that draw phase, we get to play a land for the turn, and then basically I look at it as saying creatures you control gain haste until end of turn, because then the zombies we got from the prior turn, after we got our extra turn, now can attack, and so we have that extra combat. So honestly, this deck really, really wants all the extra turn spells, but I know that that's not a popular thing to do in Commander, and people get a little pissed at that. So there's 2 full extra turn spells within this deck, which we'll talk about in a second. In addition to, technically, we are running the Savor the Moment as our 3rd extra turn spell. And there's only 3. And then we are running Virtue of Knowledge. Now, let me read actually the instant first. For 2 mana, we can play Vantress Visions, copy target activated or triggered ability you control. You may choose new targets for the copy. For 2 mana, we can copy a fetch land trigger, and boom, we have just played Nature's Lore again. And then Virtue of Knowledge is synergizing so well with our Field of the Dead because it says, for 5 mana, if a permanent entering the battlefield causes a triggered ability of a permanent you control to trigger, that ability triggers an additional time. So we're doubling up all of our Field of Dead triggers. So this deck was basically made for Virtue of Knowledge. Walking Atlas is a 2 mana 1/1 creature construct. Tap, put a land card from your hand onto the battlefield. This does have infinite combos with, I believe, Moloku and Retreat to Coral Helm, and I believe Trade Routes has a separate infinite combo in there. I will have those on the screen here, but Walking Atlas is just a great option in the early game just to spew out more lands onto the battlefield. And then Wayfarer's Bauble, again, for basically 3 mana, we can ramp out a basic. All right, so that's our ramp category. That's what's going to be propelling us to about the 10 to 12 mana range by the time we get to turn 9. And so what else are we going to be doing in between then? Well, we're going to be looking for Field of the Dead. So let's actually cover our ways to get Field of the Dead. First, we have to talk about Expedition Map. So this is a 1 mana artifact. You can pay 2, sack it, to search library for a land card, reveal it, put it in your hand, then shuffle. A lot of our tutors are built around finding Expedition Map. So Dizzy Spell, for example, is a 1 mana instant. We don't care about what it does, but it has Transmute, which allows us to pay 3 and search library for a CMC 1 card and put it into our hand. And we are going to absolutely do that with our Expedition Map. Or if we really need the mana in an emergency, go search up a Soul Ring. You have just tutored out a Soul Ring. Drift of Phantasms is going to be a 3 mana transmuter that is most of the time going to grab our Copy Land enchantment. Now, Copy Land enters as a copy of any land on the battlefield. So once we get Field of the Dead out, we want to start copying it, which Drift of Phantasms can help us do. And also, I think the other target that you will grab between these two targets, probably 99% of the time, we can also go grab a Rhystic Study, which is just honestly great. I would absolutely pay 6 mana to just put Rhystic Study onto the battlefield. Then we have Fabricate, which can search us up an artifact card, and Fabricate also has another juicy target in Coat of Arms, which is right here, which gives all of our creatures +1/+1 for each other creature on the battlefield that shares at least one creature type with it. So we're making a ton of zombies, and so they're going to be getting huge off of Coat of Arms. And it can also search us up our Anduril Narsil Reforged, which says whenever equipped creature attacks, put a +1/+1 counter on each creature you control. But if you have the city's blessing, which means you control 10 or more permanents, put 2/1/1 counters on each creature you control instead. And that's for basically 5 mana as we pay 2 and then equip for 3. And then our third juicy target here in the overrun category is Dragon Throne of Tarkir, 4 mana. This is the most scuffed of the buffs within mono blue, but it is a option to buff our zombies nonetheless. For 4 mana, we can then equip for 3, so we're up to 7 total mana. Equipped creature has Defender, and pay 2, tap. Other creatures you control gain trample and get +X/+X until end of turn, where X is this creature's power. So hopefully we are cheating this out with perhaps like a War of Invention or something, but Dragon Throne technically is a way to put all of our accumulated mana to use to get an overrun in mono blue, and this is honestly scuffed in any other color. I would not run this, but mono blue, once again, really struggles to generate combat buffs, and you could maybe perhaps this with an evasive option like Archetype of Imagination or something like that, but I find that you really need to generate the damage on board to push through your opponent's boards, and so that's why Dragon Throne is in here, which also can be searched out via our artifact tutors. Merchant Scroll is more of a tutor for our board wipes. However, technically we can play this for 1 with Baral to get Dizzy Spell, which we can then use the transmute ability to search for Expedition Map, which will search us for up Field of the Dead. So there is a line with Merchant Scroll to get Field of the Dead, but it's very expensive and very inefficient. Instead, I often find myself grabbing our Cyclonic Rift, which is going to be the tutor, I think, perhaps 75–70% of the time. And we can also grab Perplexing Test off of this as well, which is going to be a 5-mana board wipe that spares tokens most of the time. But I just want to mention that technically we can work our way to Field of the Dead with Merchant Scroll. Teleria West, once again, is our land that can search up Field of the Dead because we can search our library for a card with CMC 0, which Field of the Dead is. Trinket Mage can go grab us Expedition Map and also Soul Ring if we care about that. And we are also running Seat of the Synod, which here it is. Seat of the Synod is a 0 CMC artifact, which can also be searched up via Trinket Mage if we need to make a land drop. Then we have War of Invention, which is another artifact tutor. And this has Improvise and will probably be discounted with Baral. So most of the time, I think this is going to go get Expedition Map. Although I think, once again, this can honestly be used to grab your Coat of Arms once you have the Field of the Dead on the battlefield and ready to swing with the zombies we've accumulated. All right, and then we've also got our card draw category. So our card draw is going to be more focused on card selection baked into the card draw. So we are not running super efficient options like, let me go find here. What's a better example than Winged Words? Chart a Course would be an example. Most of the time in normal decks, I like these types of effects. Chart a Course, draw 2 cards and discard a card unless you attack this turn. But in a mono blue Landfall deck where we have a lot of mana to use and we want to find Field of the Dead in a hurry, we are baking in a lot more card selection into our card draw. So what I mean by that is Dig Through Time, for example, has Delve, 6 blue, but it has Delve. Look at the top 7 cards of the library, put 2 of them into your hand and the rest on the bottom of your library in any order. We also have a few other functional copies of Dig Through Time. Drawn from Dreams is a 4 mana that does the exact same thing. There's also Memory Deluge, which is a 4 mana instant. Look at the top X cards of the library, where X is the amount of mana spent to cast a spell, and it has flashback for 7. So the first time around we look at 4, but if we cast it for 7, we look at 7. Speaking of looking at 4 cards, we have Scattered Thoughts. Look at the top 4 cards of the library, put 2 of those cards into your hand and the rest into your graveyard. By the way, the fact that these are all instants is great because we can bluff the fact that we have a counterspell if your opponents don't know that we're not running any counterspells within the deck. They might make suboptimal plays anticipating that you might have counters up. We also have Behold the Multiverse, 4 mana instant, scry 2, then draw 2 cards, but we can pay it in installments of 2 by foretelling it and then paying the 1 in a blue. And then the way that this works with Brawl, by the way, is that because with the foretell ability, you are exiling it face down, you are not casting it. It does not get the discount. However, when you actually cast it for the 1 in a blue, that's when the discount will apply because that is when the actual cast happens. Deep Analysis is a cool piece of synergy with Brawl on the field because it is basically a 4 mana draw 4. If he reduces the initial cast from 4 to 3, that means it's a 3 mana draw 2, basically a divination, but then we can flash it back for only 1 later. So both of those combined means we're paying 4 mana to draw a total of 4 cards. Then I'll go back up top here. Amanitu's Augury, more of a finisher card in the deck, but this technically does allow us to get an extra land on the field because it says exile the top 8 cards of the library. You may put a land card from among them on a battlefield. Until end of turn, for each non-land card type, you may cast a spell of that type from among the exiled cards without paying its mana cost. Now, if we flip over it really quick here to our types, I will say that this actually is incidentally great with Amanitu's Augury because we have lots of different types. 22 sorceries, 14 artifacts, 8 creatures, 10 instants, 6 enchantments, and then of course we will probably get a land off of that as well. So just an incidentally great spread for Amanitu's Augury here. Let's see, what have we not touched on from this category? Fairy Mastermind is going to be also functioning as an emergency blocker in the air. It not only draws you a lot of cards and can force a lot of card draw within the late game. If we want to bury a bunch of mana into it, then we can do that. But this is also just a good blocker to have in the air. Lorien Revealed can search us up an island, or if we have Brawl in the field, we can cast this as a 4 mana draw 3, which is really super playable. And then we have Mystic Remora. Everybody pretty much knows Mystic Remora, but whenever an opponent casts a non-creature spell, you may draw a card unless that player pays 4, which basically nobody will do. cumulative upkeep to keep Mystic Remora around. And then, of course, we have Rhystic Study. Now, Rhystic Study, I know certain people have feelings about. It's very annoying. It's just an unfair card. It's arguably the best blue card in the entire format, but I figured the fact that this is already a jank archetype within mono blue, also a somewhat jank color combination, I figured it would be okay to put Rhystic Study into this deck, and I don't know, just move on from there. But again, you can run Curse of Verbosity if you don't like Rhystic Study, or any other instant sorcery that can draw cards that you'll synergize with Baral. Okay, and then finally, we'll just cover really quick our cantrips. Brainstorm, we are running a lot of fetch lands in the deck, so Brainstorm gets super powered within this deck, because what you can do is if you Brainstorm, you draw 3, then put 2 cards from your hand on top of your library, you play your fetch land, then you crack your fetch, and that will end up with a library shuffle. You have just drawn 3 cards and gotten rid of whatever cards you don't want, and so it's just a great card selection here. Curate, so you will know that other than Brainstorm and incidentally Gitaxian Probe, Curate and Start the TARDIS are 2 mana cantrips. And the reason why is that they curve out really well into Baral, because Baral, instead of running like a 1 mana cantrip like Ponder or something, we can actually rely on Baral being on the field and then on turn 3 casting these with the extra discount. So Curate is going to be an instant Surveil to draw a card, and you will notice that these are focused on Surveil and not Scry, because we want cards into our graveyard for specific reasons, such as in particular Candlekeep Inspiration. So let me just go on over to our overruns category for a moment. I know we're jumping around here, but just stay with me, folks. Candlekeep Inspiration says 5 mana sorcery. Until end of turn, creatures you control have base power and toughness XX, where X is the number of cards you own in exile and in your graveyard that are instants, sorceries, and or have an adventure. So that is why we care about having instants and sorceries and lands in our graveyard. And once again, we already talked about Crucible of Worlds. We want to be putting lands into our graveyard, and we can be using our dig through time to use those as delve fodder. So that's going to be just another reason to put cards into our graveyard. So both Curate and Start the TARDIS have Surveil to then draw a card, basically functional copies of each other. Gitaxian Probe is a completely free spell that's a sorcery that we want in the graveyard. I did look at including Urza's Bauble and what is the other one? Urza's Bauble and I believe Mishra's Bauble are the 2 options here. You can also run as basically 0 mana cantrips that basically make your deck go from 100 cards to 99 cards, but they're artifacts, and we don't really care about artifacts being in the yard more so than instants and sorceries. So, I mean, technically, if we're being, I guess, full sweat, we'd probably put these in, but the reason why I guess I didn't want them is because they actually give you the card draw at the beginning of the next turn, and I would want a cantrip such as Gitaxian Probe to just give me the card right away, because I might be really waiting for a land to play or something like that to trigger a bunch of synergies on board. Finally, we have Ledger Shredder. 2 mana, 1/3, creature bird advisor with flying. Whenever a player casts their second spell each turn, Ledger Shredder connives, which makes for a great blocker in the air, and then also this just digs you through your deck at quite an incredible rate for only 2 mana. So for only 2 mana, we might see 5-6 cards into our deck, and we might find more of the tutors that we really need to have in our hands, and we can just discard whatever we don't need at the time. Okay, so that brings me to let's just actually touch on our overruns category, and then we'll move on to our defense. So like I already mentioned, Ondoril is going to put 2/1 counters on each creature we control every time a creature we control attacks. Candlekeep Inspiration is going to be a great overrun. Coat of Arms, great overrun, although this might backfire on you with other tribal decks at the table. It's it's basically a rite of passage in Commander at this point to get killed by your own Coat of Arms, which I'm perfectly fine with. I mean, that's just the risk you take with the card. Dragon Throne we already talked about, and then the last one I just want to mention, Sakashima's Will. 4 mana sorcery, choose one. If you control commanders, you cast a spell, you may choose both. Target opponent chooses a creature they control, you gain control of it. Choose a creature you control. Each other creature you control becomes a copy of that creature until end of turn. So this is a theft effect, but we're really playing it for that second mode where we want our zombies, our 2/2 zombies, to become literally anything else. If we're able to steal a vanilla 4/4 or a vanilla 3/3, probably not the vanilla 3/3, that's not super good, but if we have a vanilla 4/4 we can obtain, we are happy to basically look at this as a 4 mana, give our creatures +2/+2 until end of turn, and it gets way better than that because we're actually running a suite of theft spells where we can hopefully take giant creatures on the board, like a Gulta, or that would be sort of Magical Christmas Land, but let me just touch on our removal category here. That's a nice segue, actually. We're running things like Blatant Thievery. So for each opponent gain control of target permanent that player controls, let's say you go grab somebody's 6/6 Inferno Titan. Well, all of a sudden with Sakashima's Will, you can have all of your zombies become an Inferno Titan, get that attack trigger, just mow everything down, and everything explodes in a giant explosions and fireworks, which is great. We're also running Expropriate, another great theft effect that we pair up with an extra turn to basically give everything haste. And Expropriate just has too much synergy within the deck to not include. I know this is a card that a lot of people get salty about as well, considering that it's basically 9 mana win the game, but this is 9 mana just supercharged synergy within our deck, because not only do we get the best thing on our opponent's field, but we also get an extra turn, which allows us to make an extra land drop and attack with all of that stuff. Then we have Mass Manipulation, which is going to be a finisher. This is going to be a backup win con. This card, we're hoping, can basically win the game all by itself, where you are going to be paying at minimum between 10 to 12 mana into this. And I'm not lying, this deck can really generate that much mana by about turn 8. And where we're going to probably take control of the best 4 creatures on the board, and hopefully win from there. And then finally, we have Subjugate the Hobbits, which is one of my personal favorite cards that I think went completely unnoticed from the Lord of the Rings set, but has been amazing every time I have cast it. 7 mana sorcery, gain control of each non-commander creature with mana value 3 or less, and notably this grabs tokens. So this grabs all of the sweet accumulated creature board that your opponents have assembled, which is great, because let's say that we haven't drawn one of our board wipes. Well, now we can just take control of it, so no matter what, we actually profit. And let me talk about our board wipes really quick, because this is going to be an important tempo play within the deck. So we have Consuming Tide, which is going to be 4 mana sorcery. Each player chooses a non-land permanent they control. Return all non-land permanents not chosen this way to their owner's hands. Then you draw a card for each opponent who has more cards in their hand than you. Now, when I'm looking at board wipes, Consuming Tide fits the bill entirely for this deck, because not only does it grab all non-land permanents, which we care about getting artifacts and enchantments off the board if somebody has like a, I don't know, like a propaganda or something defending them, we definitely want to get all the artifacts and enchantments. The awesome part about this as well is that we don't have a lot of non-land permanents typically that will be returning to our hand. In my playtesting, it was usually Baral and then between 1 and 2 artifacts. And if we cast Consuming Tide on turn 5 or 6, you can bet your bottom that everybody is going to have at least 5 or 6 things that are returning to their hand. And so I anticipate that on average, this will draw you about 2 cards. So if you look at it as a board wipe where their opponents keep their best thing, but then you draw 2 cards, this is still a great tempo play that we want to see in our hand. Cyclonic Rift, everybody knows, returning each non-land permanent you don't control to its owner's hand, and as an emergency mode, you can cast it for 2 mana to just bounce a single thing. Then we have Flood of Tears. 6 mana sorcery, return all non-land permanents to their owner's hands. If you return 4 or more non-token permanents you control this way, you may put a permanent card from your hand onto the battlefield. So this, once again, is going to be a tempo play. I actually look at Flood of Tears more as an extra turn spell than anything else, because we want to bounce everything. We know that our opponents are going to redeploy, but we do buy ourselves basically another turn to then draw a card, play a land, trigger all of our landfall synergies, and this gets rid of non-land permanents. So once again, just absolutely ices everything on the board. Gets around ward, gets around hexproof. Really, there's nothing opponents can do to stop this other than counter it on the stack. And the bonus part here is that technically this can ramp us a land because it says put any permanent card from your hand onto the battlefield. So that's even great because then we can just, make another land drop if we return 4 or more. I don't think the 4 or more will happen all the time, but maybe, 30 to 40% of the time we'll be able to ramp out another land from Flood of Tears. Perplexing Test is going to, most of the time for 5 mana at an instant speed, choose when to return all non-token creatures to their owner's hands, which will spare our Field of the Dead zombies. Raise the Palisade will choose a zombie creature type, return all creatures that aren't of the chosen type to their owner's hands. And then we have Season of Weaving, 6 mana, sorcery, choose up to 5 pause worth of modes. You may choose the same mode more than once. Most of the time, I think we're going to pay the 3 to return each non-land non-token permanent to its owner's hand, and then draw 2 cards. So basically like a better version of Consuming Tide, because it ices all non-land non-token permanents while sparing our zombies once again, and it draws us more cards. And then I have run into a couple of times where if we have like a patchwork banner on the battlefield, for example, we can create a token copy of this to then give our zombies +1/+1 instead of drawing the cards if we already have a bunch of cards in our hand, which is pretty great. And then I believe that just brings us to our Field of the Dead synergies, which is last but definitely not least. So we already touched on Copy Land, which is going to be 3 mana copy Field of the Dead. Echoes of Eternity. This is 3 and 3 waste pips. So actual colorless mana we require, which is not at all a problem in this deck. Once again, we are running a total of 16 colorless producing lands. So super easy to hit this, and especially when we are going to be playing Field of the Dead and copying Field of the Dead, we're going to be swimming in waste mana. This is a Kindred Enchantment, Eldrazi. If a triggered ability of a colorless spell you control or another colorless permanent you control triggers, that ability triggers an additional time. Guess what? Field of the Dead is colorless, so this will double up all of our Field of the Dead triggers. And then whenever you cast a colorless spell, copy it. You may choose new targets for the copy. Guess how many artifacts we have in the deck that can be copied? We have 14 artifacts, and boy, I cannot believe what would happen if you have 2 Coat of Arms on the battlefield. That would just be absolutely insane, and I think you would have to win the turn that comes down. That would be just crazy. And then our last copy spell here is Replication Technique, 5 mana sorcery with Demonstrate, which we always want to be doing. It says when you cast a spell, you may copy it if you do choose an opponent to also copy it. Players may choose new targets for their copies. Create a token that's a copy of target permanent you control. This is the only spell within blue outside of Copy Land that will copy a target permanent. So most of the time, 99% of the time, this is going to be copy, get 2 copies of Field of the Dead, but maybe we've already fired off our, Blatant Thievery, for example. We can fire off a Replication Technique to just double up on whatever the best creature is on our board, which will demand answers from our opponents. So some spicy synergy there. And then finally, we will touch on our lands, which in this particular deck, I had to put a lot of thought and care into because, of course, we care about Field of the Dead getting 7 or more lands of different names, and there's other considerations such as how many basics we want in order to not run out of basic fuel for our Surveyor Scope, for example, but we need a certain number of differently named lands to get our Field of the Dead trigger. So this is our land category. So here we have Ancient Tomb, which will tap for 2 colorless, but it will deal 2 damage to us each time. Archway of Innovation is mostly here as an untapped blue source because it enters tapped unless you control an island, which we will have most of the time. And then it says we can pay 1 blue, tap at the next spell you cast this turn, has Improvise, which again, we have plenty of artifacts on the battlefield. If we really find these synergies to give something Improvise, we can tap our equipment and so forth. Castle Vantress, again, another untapped blue source, enters tapped unless you control an island. You will never want to activate the Scry ability. I'd rather lose the game, honestly, than activate the Scry ability because it's so expensive to just Scry 2. Really, you're paying 5 mana to Scry 2. Absolutely unacceptable. Demolition Field is going to be a colorless producing land that enters untapped, but we can pay 2 and sack it to destroy target non-basic land an opponent controls, and then they search out a basic, and we search out a basic as well, and that enters untapped. So this is basically a fetch land with upside that can actually destroy a non-basic our opponent has. Evolving Wilds is going to be a tapped fetch land that's going to search out either an island, a snow-covered island, a waste, or a snow-covered waste. Field Passage, same thing, but it enters untapped. Field of the Dead, of course. Floated Strand is going to be a fetch land that will enter untapped. Horizon of Progress does tap for blue because we could pay 1 to tap to add 1 mana of any type the land you control could produce. And then we can pay 3 and tap it to put a land card from your hand onto the battlefield tapped. So a nice way to actually ramp. And I have in playtesting used Horizon of Progress ability to ramp. That is not out of the question here. But then if we really don't need the land, we can play it, get a Field of the Dead trigger, pay 1, tap it, and sack it to then draw a card. So it actually cycles pretty easily there. Ipnu Rivulet, again, another source of untapped blue mana that has a different name, but we don't need to pay take the 1 life every time because it taps for colorless for free. We have 3 islands, and we have, let me just run over the rest of the basics here. We have 3 snow-covered islands, 1 snow-covered wastes, and then 1 regular wastes. So a total of 8 basics in the deck, but 6 basic islands. We have Manama School at Water's Edge, which is untapped blue source, and I guess we can on untap target legendary permanent. Very fringe use cases for that ability. Misty Rainforest, nice fetch land. Mirrored Landscape can pay 2 and tap it to sack it to search library for up to 2 base land cards that share a land type with the mono battlefield tapped, then shuffle. This can only search out an island, and honestly, most of the time you'll probably want to grab both an island and a snow-covered island, which you can do. But notably, you cannot use it to search up wastes because they do not have a basic land type. So you are locked into searching up islands with Myriad Landscape. Mystic Sanctuary. Oh, and by the way, with Mirror Landscape, what I like to do, so it'll enter tapped, but then you just wait to search out those islands. Do not be in a rush to crack this to search out those islands because we want to wait until we've got 2, 3 Field of the Deads on the battlefield before we tap it and crack this to get those 2 landfall triggers. So just, big warning there to just wait until you get maximum value out of this. Mystic Sanctuary, it's an island, so it can technically be searched out with our Misty Rainforest. It enters tapped unless you control 3 or more other islands. When it enters untapped, you may put target instant or sorcery card from a graveyard on top of your library. So technically, the grossest thing to do with this would be to grab an extra turn spell. But I don't know. I mean, most of the time, I'm just looking to have another source of blue that's not named island so that this can trigger Field of the Dead synergies. Oboro Palace in the Clouds, legendary land, untapped source of blue. And then if we want to, we can actually, if we're missing a land in our hand, we can pay 1 to return it to our owner's hand, and then we can play it as land for turn to continue to get those Field of the triggers. Otawara can bounce something, of course, if you pay its channel ability, but other than that, it's an untapped source of blue. Polluted Delta, fetch land, untapped source of blue. Prismatic Vista, untapped source of blue. Scalding Tarn, same thing. Seed of the Synod, once again, an artifact land that can be searched out. 3 snow-covered island, 1 snow-covered waste. Talon Gates of Madara is a nice piece of protection and technically can be ramped out because we can pay 4 to put it from our hand onto the battlefield, so we can pay 4 to ramp out a land. Again, not the worst, actually. This is a viable ability to play, I might add. Temple of the False God is just an auto-include, although I don't know, well, we'll not say auto-include because there's a lot of controversy around Temple of the False God, but in particular in landfall decks, when we're focusing on lands this much, Temple of the False God I think can reliably be played or searched out to tap for 2. Terrain Generator, we can pay 2, tap it to put a basic land card from hand onto the battlefield tapped. So just an easy way to ramp up basics if we have them in our hand. Thespian Stage can be used to copy Field of the Dead. 3 Tree City, once we have zombies on the field, this taps for a buttload of mana, but we need zombies first, so this is really more of a late game play, and until then, it's just an untapped source of colorless, which is fine. Urborg, both Urborg and Yavimaya Cradle of Growth are in the deck so that they can allow us to tap our fetch lands for colorless, or I guess, whatever green or black mana, depending on which of them is on the field. And we can save our fetch land triggers for a big burst later on. Urza's Cave can search for Field of the Dead by paying 3 and sacking it. Urza Saga Of course, we can, search up our expedition map with the conclusion of Chapter 3. And in playtesting, I have also found it useful to activate the second chapter on turn 2 if we don't have anything else to do, or we are missing blue pips from our land generation or hand. Vesuva is going to be basically the second land we search out to copy Field of the Dead. Once Field of the Dead is on the battlefield, we have a Wastes, and then of course we already covered Yavimaya. So that is our mono blue Baral Chief of Compliance Landfall deck. I hope you guys found this very interesting. I think that this is a jank deck, but I think that I'm really proud of this design. I'm not going to lie. I think this design is pretty clever to sneak in as many little landfall entering synergies as we possibly could with a very unusual commander at the helm that we are still getting a lot of use out of because he also ramps us. So ramp is the name of the game in mono blue, and even if we are somehow not finding Field of the Dead, we have a lot of backup ways to win the game, even without Field of the Dead. That is going to be the video, guys. Once again, I will make a gold fishing playtest video where you can see how this deck functions. I'll have that link down in the description. You can check that out. And then if you enjoyed this deck tech, leave a like on it and subscribe to see more cool deck techs like this. So that is mono blue Landfall, everybody. I hope you enjoyed once again, and hopefully we'll see you all in the next one.